Welcome to a brand new episode of New Ways of Being. Now, in the last episode, I had asked the question, what is consciousness? And in answering that question, um, I really began to get into another question, which is the question I'm going to ask in this episode and answer. Why raise your consciousness? Why is that important? And I began really answering it in the previous episode, but I'm going to go deeper into answering why we want to raise our consciousness um, and help you understand it in a deeper perspective. Now, I ended the last episode uh, by saying this. I said, are you beginning to see that your level of consciousness, which could be a low level of consciousness where you're stuck in victimhood and see the world and yourself in a very negative light, or it could be a much higher level of consciousness, which is based in unity and love and understanding who you are in your real true self and understanding the universe at some level, um, because you are a part of the universe. And that is actually key to talking about consciousness. But I said, are you beginning to see that your level of consciousness determines how happy you are and the results you are getting in your life? Consciousness is something that is worthy of study because you can learn to shift into higher and deeper levels of awareness and thereby change what you are experiencing in life and the results you are producing. When you are spending more time in awareness, you can use thinking selectively as needed more effectively to greater effect. And interestingly, you will always be more creative when you are coming from a state of awareness. Okay, so let me go on and explain a little bit more about that. So, true creativity arises not from thinking, but from awareness, especially heart centered awareness, and from inner knowing, intuition, and inspiration. So, raising your consciousness to ever higher levels is a way of expanding your potential for bigger and better results. For bigger and better results, you need to be more, to have a higher perspective and be more creative. And it opens the door to creating the life of your dreams and even experiencing qualities of life that you might call heaven on earth. And in fact, I did a an episode quite some time ago, a year ago. I can't remember exactly, but I talked about creating heaven on earth and how it is a state of consciousness. You can choose to experience pure love, peace, and wholeness continuously, not just once in a while. You can choose to know that at a deep level within you, the level of unity consciousness, you are truly abundant because the universe is abundant. You can know love, peace, and wholeness because the universe is love, peace, and wholeness. You can tap into that inner knowing. Now, let me kind of back up a little bit and say that there are many different ways to think about consciousness. You can think of them as ways of being. Some people focus totally on emotions and are often dominated by those emotions. Some people focus on energy within themselves and talk in terms of energy and are maybe even able to manipulate energy in their bodies. Some people focus on mindset, but that is at risk of staying too much in their thoughts. So their thoughts of being in the world and how successful they are may depend on how aware they are at the same time. And finally, some people focus on attitude, and attitude is interesting because it often bridges thinking and awareness. So their results often depend on the balance between the two. If they lead with awareness, they will be more successful. But if they let thinking dominate, they will often be stuck in different disempowering patterns of negative thoughts and negative emotions and reacting unconsciously. But here's the bottom line about raising consciousness. Expanding one's awareness is the ultimate key to experience life in more powerful, joyful, and loving ways. And note, love is the force that unifies the universe as a whole and the parts within it. You can just call it unity, but spiritual explorers will tell you it is love and the universe is loving. Let me give a couple of examples of people who have shifted their consciousness to greater awareness and being more of service to themselves and others. Nelson Mandela is often cited because he made a big shift and helped change the political and social landscape in South Africa, a country that had apartheid, a political system of racial segregation and discrimination that suppressed non-whites. And he spent 27 years in prison, during which he steadily shifted his consciousness from, focusing on how to support guerrilla resistance to apartheid to instead supporting change through a peaceful process of negotiation and helping leaders of apartheid become more aware and able to see new possibilities of moving beyond apartheid. Upon his release, he played a leading role in peacefully dismantling apartheid and later was elected president of his country. Mary Morrissey is another notable example of someone who greatly shifted her consciousness that changed the course of her life. First beginning as an unwed mother in high school at a time when that was considered totally taboo. The negative pressures of that led to her becoming quite ill in the hospital and near death. But she became inspired by a visiting practitioner, by a visiting practitioner of science of mind. And as a result of what she was told, she was able to change her thinking and consciously choose to reverse the progress of her disease and became healthy again. And she went on to become a successful New Thought minister. Um, and unfortunately, disaster struck her again. It was a financial disaster because her husband embezzled a large sum of money from the church without her knowledge. She ended up leaving her husband and had to take bankruptcy, but she chose to expand her consciousness and raise herself up from failure. And she went on, now this all happened over a number of years, but she went on to become and to build a hugely successful training organization for life coaches, which she still runs today and is a well-known and admired multi-millionaire businesswoman. So, and there are, untold numbers of people who, by shifting their consciousness, becoming more aware and more aware of the possibilities and more become aware of their who they are and their own potential, they they did similar kinds of things. They changed their lives in dramatic ways. So those were just two examples. Aligning with the universe. At this point, I believe it is important to go back to the recent leap in scientific understanding that I mentioned in the previous episode. And that scientific understanding now fully agrees with old spiritual wisdom, the teachings of spiritual masters, that consciousness itself is at the core of what the universe is and how it works. And if that is true, then the more we understand and connect to the deeper universal consciousness, the more effective we can be. What I've found in my own exploration of how the universe works and in my own experiences is that relating to and knowing universal consciousness personally is crucial. And, from my own point of view, it's because I need to align with how the universe works rather than operating uh, consciously or unconsciously in ways that aren't aligned with reality. Consciousness is not itself visible. So that makes it, something that's a bit mysterious. But the effects of consciousness are usually visible or felt in some way. Now, of course, since universal consciousness is what religions and spirituality have long referred to as God or other equivalent terms such as Allah, spirit, infinite intelligence, and there are many more names for God, but uh, consciousness, therefore, cannot be separated completely from spirituality. And we can't completely know universal consciousness firsthand. So there are still mystical aspects to it. But it is helpful to note that spiritual teachings and today's science both tell us that the universe is one whole, a unified entity, and therefore universal consciousness is singular and pervades the physical universe. Individual human consciousness, which you or I have, is part of the one universal consciousness. So many people have not been clear about that up until now. And so the new discoveries are giving us new insights. And so we are intimately connected with what has been called the divine. More than that, at a deep level, we are all part of the divine. There is both scientific proof and mystical truth that we are all interconnected with each other and part of the divine. In fact, we can say that the universe is conscious and we are the universe. Once we truly understand that these statements are true, we must begin seeing all human beings as universal beings and divine beings. Now, I refer to that interconnectedness as being part of one great whole as wholeness. And I wrote a book called Awakening to Wholeness. That was my early attempt to talk about my experiences in understanding wholeness beyond healing. And I understood wholeness to arrive from the universal nature of one consciousness and the unified field. Wholeness is an important part of fully understanding consciousness. And that's why wholeness plays a central role, for example, in Deepak Chopra's writings, such as his book, Metahuman, and my book on awakening to wholeness. And there have been others that recognize the importance of wholeness or unity of the universe. And also, by the way, the word divine, the word divine has always been thought of as meaning essentially beyond an ordinary human experience. And for those uh, for religious people or spiritual people, then it would have been uh, equated to God. Divine is equated to God without necessarily understanding that it was one singular consciousness behind God. So we are all a part of the divine, is what we're now coming to know. We are coming to know that we're part of that universal consciousness, that wholeness that it is, and that for therefore we aren't these isolated, independent beings who are, you know, struggling to live in a anyway, maybe perhaps for some people, but struggling. We look at the world as a whole, operate as uh, out of kindness and out of love and out of that that wholeness that we are, that unity that we are. Um, so now we can begin to realize that when we say we're a part of this one universe, this one divine entity that is the whole universe itself, that changes things greatly. So I want to say a bit more about that. So I checked the dictionary definition of wholeness, and if you look at that, you'll get a very myopic, limited answer about um, it means being complete, and in some usage in modern days, it's used to mean health, both perhaps mentally and physically, but it's much more than those definitions. So I asked ChatGPT to give me a definition of wholeness in the fullest sense this moment. So here is that definition. I think it's a good one and helpful. Wholeness is the integrated and dynamic state of being in which all aspects of existence, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and cosmic, are harmonized and experienced as a unified, interconnected whole. It reflects the deep recognition that all parts of the self, all beings, and all elements of the universe are fundamentally interrelated and originate from a singular source or ground of being. So many of you will recognize many spiritual concepts in that definition, which have always been universally true for the most part. Now science is embracing this as well. So stop and think about wholeness, and especially the relationship between the divine and humans for just a moment. To me, it requires that we explore into our relationship with what I call one consciousness or God interchangeably, or what in scientific terms might be called the principle of universal consciousness. But the unity or wholeness of the universe implies that individual consciousness is a part of universal consciousness. They are not separate things in any way. And it may not be easy to fully understand exactly what that means. It seems to tell us that we are divine. We are more powerful than we know, more powerful than we thought we were in terms of co creative potential, and that we have access to the contents of universal consciousness, maybe in forms of information or knowledge or insight and wisdom. But that that's something that we may not have known before that we are capable of. In other words, universal consciousness is an infinite resource available to our individual consciousness. I believe it makes sense to align our individual consciousness to universal consciousness to the greatest degree possible. And to do that, we must pay attention to both. Every human being is part of the one consciousness that is the unifying and evolutionary essence of the universe itself. And that is the most important thing everyone must come to know now. That is what raising consciousness is ultimately all about. Why do we want to do it? We want to be a part of the universe as a whole. The universe is this enormous, vast being, if you will, that is consciousness, and it is evolving in its own consciousness. And as that happens, we can participate in that evolution. We can become more aware, more wise, more able to create and enjoy the life that we want. So why wouldn't we want to do that? Raising consciousness is, it's like being offered, here's this grand world that is possible to you. Do you want to do it by choosing to raise your consciousness? I'm screaming yes. Why wouldn't you? Up until now, that people have not understood this. So this is new. If you're coming from maybe the scientific materialist perspective, you may not have known this. You may have known it if you came from a more spiritual perspective and exploring into spirit, which is consciousness. Okay, but now we are beginning to understand this much more clearly. So that is the most important thing everyone must come to know. That is what raising consciousness is ultimately all about. Now, exploring into these insights is necessary because otherwise we don't know how to use this understanding or what limits there are to our individual power. In my explorations, I've learned that spiritual channelers, often through podcasts that they have, and messengers, often through books such as A Course in Miracles or Conversations with God, have given us various levels of insights and guidance. And in fact, I've come to understand at a deeper level to know that there is a universal consciousness and intelligence that fully wants individuals to become creators of their own lives so that they can create lives that are truly that they love. In other words, we are meant to evolve in consciousness past the fears, struggles, and conflicts that we have so prominent today to create better and grander personal life experiences and even a better world that is good for all, not just some. The shift that will change the world. Universal consciousness, the divine, is totally loving and non-judgmental. I know this from my own experience. All spiritual masters have taught this. Um, actually, you know, otherwise people might still question what I just said, that the universal consciousness is totally loving and non-judgmental. But going back years, in fact, if you've heard my old podcast episodes, you've heard me say that uh, the universe is loving in its nature because that loving nature is what holds the universe together. If and it The singular one consciousness, if you think about how that has evolved, it has evolved as this being that we might call God. But you might think, well, it could be any kind of being, but no, that's not true. A universe that's based on uh, a lack of caring, for example, or even based on evil, the result would be everything within the universe would be destructive. It would self destruct, and we would not be here talking about it. So, the nature of the universe is naturally totally loving. And you will know, I know from spiritual masters and from my own direct personal experience relating to universal consciousness, I know that is totally non-judgmental and that all beings within the universe are equal. So I invite everyone to seek to expand awareness, unity, and love within themselves and to share awareness, unity, and love with all other beings. And for most of us, we think directly, mostly about other human beings, because we are all part of a unified world and unified universe. In looking at the world today, I would say most human beings are operating at the level of ego consciousness, which is heavily based on mental conditioning, what we've been taught over our whole lives, and the belief in separation. We look at ourselves as being physically separate, and therefore we think all beings are separate. In ego consciousness, we operate therefore from fear, distrust, worry most of the time. But all people have the capability to shift to awareness consciousness, enabling us to be more in the present and knowing that we are part of universal consciousness in our essence, and that wholeness is our true nature. Universal love is an attribute of one consciousness, and it is a natural empathic response to knowing that we are all expressions of the one universal consciousness at our core beingness. We are all one. Knowing this, love and unity must become two all important keywords and intentions for our world. Now, wouldn't you agree? If we are all one consciousness, all one being in the universe, then we need to not first understand our we need to first understand our own divinity, if we will. We are part of that one consciousness that people call God, and that every other person, and in fact, every other being, uh, is a part of that. So human beings are all equal. Other types of animals, for example, are a part of it as well. They have lesser capabilities of awareness and consciousness and lack self-awareness, but they are also parts of the universe. I know that there are many different levels of consciousness that are possible, but let's just keep it simple for now and talk about the two levels that I just mentioned a couple minutes ago. Ego consciousness, which has produced the world we live in based on separation and fear, and unitive awareness based on unity and wholeness. I believe the potential of the latter, unity of awareness, is unlimited and is constructive, creative, and unified in its nature, whereas ego consciousness has proven to be destructive, inequitable, and prone to constant divisiveness, conflicts, and unhappiness for most of humanity. So I'm proposing a shift from ego consciousness to awareness. You can make that shift in consciousness by changing your worldview to align with the evolving consciousness and unity of the universe. Choose to operate as a human being from unity, love, equality, creativity, and empowerment for yourself and everyone, always, not just occasionally, but in everything you do. To me, the choice for every person is simple. We all would benefit by raising our personal consciousness, and we can do that most powerfully by shifting from ego consciousness to the consciousness of love, unity, and wholeness. Pardon me. If even a small portion of humanity does that, the collective human consciousness will begin to evolve to the level of awareness, love, and unity. By making that shift in consciousness, by choosing, making that choice to make that shift in consciousness, we really will change the world. And I believe a significant number of people are already awakened and continuously raising their consciousness higher for the benefit of the whole. And my podcast, The New Ways of Being, has uh, researched this and explored into it and talked about it quite a lot. The power of unconditional love consciousness is so great that 1%, if 1% of human population will begin to shift that way, then 1% will shift the whole world. I mean, the whole world will begin to change. In the book Power versus Force by David Hawkins, he explains his discoveries that one, the consciousness of human populations can reliably be measured, which he did, and two, the power of progressively higher levels of consciousness is logarithmic in nature. In other words, the power of love and unity is millions of times greater than that exhibited by most people in the world. At the time that Hawkins' book was published, only 4% of the world's population calibrated at the power or energy level of love. And although many people would say that that number has decreased since that book came out, I think it was in the 1990s, um, I see evidence everywhere that it is steadily going up in spite of appearances. To better understand what is meant by raising human consciousness, let me give you two simple examples at a collective level. Now, so it's one thing to talk about it at the individual level, but now I'm beginning to talk about it at the collective level of all of humanity. And the first example is our consciousness of health that has increased greatly in the late 20th and early 20th centuries. And it is very related to knowing more and paying more attention to. That's more awareness of nutrition and the food we eat and the incredible functioning of our cells and the biomes in our gut and on our skin and the critical impact of chronic stress and the costs of not attending to preventative and holistic health. So now that so many more people, a significant portion of the population does know more about all of what I just said, they're they're becoming more healthy. They It is in their consciousness. Their consciousness has been raised about their health. The second example is that our greater consciousness and acceptance of indigenous peoples and they're uh, how they deserve and are getting much more respect now uh, than in many of the past centuries, because we can now see that those people are more deeply aware of and interconnected to nature and the land and natural cycles, and uh, show more inherent intelligence in managing natural resources, as well as carrying on their culture and history and traditions. They have demonstrated in their own actions, and now we are able to see that where people 100 years ago or 200 years ago, like when the Americas were being populated, uh, they did not that understand that in the slightest, and they began to destroy natural resources and pollute the earth. And everyone knows that these days, if you're paying any attention at all. But that is all a matter of consciousness. By being conscious that they were very naturally aware that they were a part of the world around us and the universe as a whole, that there is no separation. Uh, that belief in separation came from a low level of consciousness and thinking, oh, we're human beings, we can do anything we want and we can destroy the world. But that's, obviously now we can see, that's stupidity. That's a low level of consciousness. That's destroying ourselves, not just the world. So when people, uh, well, so raising consciousness has enabled incredible advances in technology, including artificial intelligence, that have expanded our life in many ways. But those advances are primarily based in and the result of thinking, being stuck in their thinking mind. And they give us more information, but often at overwhelming rates of information overload, in other words. Technology does not necessarily expand our awareness of the unity of life and wisdom and how to live. And in fact, it has tended to be the opposite. Now, the new discoveries that I talked about in terms of science, particularly in the area of quantum physics and cosmology, and uh, the the sciences that explore into consciousness, that is growing. And so that will impact technology in certain ways, but that's fairly recent. But when we choose expanded awareness and unity, unlike technology, which can work against awareness and unity, it opens the doors to wisdom, fulfillment, love, and joy, and to changing uh, those negative impacts. When people begin to understand that separation consciousness is the source of most of the problems of individuals and humanity collectively, and that they can easily choose unity consciousness instead, why would they not make that choice? As I said, but it does require us to understand, to spread the word and educate others, educate the world about the importance of the shift in consciousness that I'm talking about. Shift away from the belief in separation and the fear that comes out of that, and the shift to then awareness and the unity that comes out of that. One important thing about consciousness, as Albert Einstein said, is that problems cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that created them. Problems must be solved from a higher level of consciousness. And of course, today we are seeing that uh, the low level of human consciousness uh, and everything it's created is destroying everything in the world. It's destroying modern civilization. Systems are breaking down. Systems of economics and financial, economic equity in particular, uh, systems of investment and infrastructure, and really social systems of every kind have been breaking down because of all of the divisiveness, and no one can understand how, what's the best way and agree on what's the best way to solve the problems. It's constantly battle. And so, what Albert Einstein said, that problems cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that created them. They have to be solved from a higher level of consciousness, tells us we have to raise our level of consciousness. Being conscious at higher levels always provides higher and greater perspectives. Also, because of our wholeness or oneness, which is universal, being aware of and caring about the larger groupings or whole of humanity is always a higher level of consciousness than just selfishly caring about oneself or one's tribe or one country. No, we need a global and universal consciousness. We truly are all one, and unity consciousness will help us solve problems and advance human life much more effectively. At this point, the raising of consciousness must happen one person at a time. Each person must come to understand the role and importance of consciousness and see the value of raising their own consciousness for their own good. But evolution is at play and works to enable greater numbers of people to be ready to become more aware. Once they've experienced the benefits of becoming more aware and using that awareness, they can quickly begin to see the greater good for all of humanity, and even better, the whole world, including Mother Earth. And that will happen by letting go of the belief in separation. And so I'm in the process of creating a book that addresses this and talks about how we can change the world by raising human consciousness. Uh, and, and that's why I'm doing it. Um, that book is intended to help bring attention to consciousness and our potential for shifting to higher levels of consciousness. Living more consciously is not that difficult for anyone. And more importantly, it is preferable to everyone once it is understood and accepted. It just takes choosing the shift away from separation consciousness and to unity consciousness instead. You can consciously choose to radiate love and unity most of the time. In fact, love and unity might well become the banner for everyone wanting to change the world. I can see us waving a flag that says love and unity. As more and more people demonstrate living at higher levels of awareness, the shift to higher consciousness will naturally grow, proliferate, and accelerate. There will be a feedback loop as more people see what higher consciousness is and why it benefits all people, not just some. They will eventually see and inherently know that the evolution of consciousness is the natural next step of humanity, and that we can together change the world for the better for all humanity. Now, there will be people out of selfishness who, right now, getting bigger shares of the global wealth because they are selfish and are taking advantage of people's lack of consciousness. So they will resist it. But you know, everyone can see once they begin to understand this, everyone's going to begin to choose it. It is just so logical, so powerful. And I believe, based on what David Hawkins' studies showed, that the the raising of consciousness will eventually begin to spread at exponentially increasing rates. Greater awareness expands greater awareness in more people and will eventually become viral. Now, now that humanity is beginning to open its eyes to greater consciousness, we are learning that there is much more to the universe than we know right now. There are many more dimensions and aspects to the universe that are just now being glimpsed because everything in the universe is based in universal consciousness. And because we are integral to that creative one consciousness, we have the potential to participate not just in our human evolution of consciousness, but in the evolution of the universe itself. And in fact, I believe that our human potential is completely beyond our ability currently to even imagine what is impossible for us. I think uh, our potential is just incredible, um, of what we will be able to create. The universe wants us to participate in this creating a better life and a better planet and a better world and ultimately a better universe. So I believe without qualification, every human being can raise their consciousness by shifting away from separation to unity and love. And as they do, they will realize that they have the power to create and experience wonderful lives and at the same time begin to create a world that is good for all, not just for some. And by good, I mean all those good adjectives like abundant, fulfilling, well being, peaceful, harmonious, empowered, creative, and loving. Raising or evolving consciousness is not a single step process, it is continuous and without limit. That means our human potential is truly unlimited and unending, and that together our future can and will be magical. Together, by expanding our awareness, we will change the world for the good of all. I hope I've given you a lot of new information to think about. I hope some of those clicked through as real insights. Oh, yeah, why would I want to do anything other than raise consciousness? So, um, listen to the episode again to keep on learning and gaining insight and wisdom. And may all of you have a great day and a great life.